So we're going to walk through setting up a charity. Okay, is that working?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think the first thing I meant, I don't know if you've got this worksheet in front of you, but it might be helpful if, as I click through, you do it at the same time, or just watch me do it and you can go through in your own time. But the first thing I always say to people when I'm discussing with them whether or not they should register as a charity, it's about first working out if what they're doing is charitable. And so I mentioned that there's these 13 charitable heads, and you need to make sure that the activities that you want to pursue through your organization actually fall under one of these charitable purposes. And it's quite, I find generally like that you can make most things charitable if you try hard enough. But what I would usually suggest is first going to, on the first link, so just this one here, takes you to some Charity Commission guidance, and which basically helps you to understand whether or not what you're doing is considered charitable by law. So just going to the first bit of guidance here about what makes a charity. And in this guidance, it essentially sets out what it means to have a charitable purpose under the law, and I guess some examples of what would be considered to be charitable. So I'm just going to drop down to those charitable heads of terms. So I mentioned there was 13 of them, and then they're basically broad headings that your activities should fall under. So this is the list here. So you can see there's other ones such as advancement of the arts and culture and heritage sites. So that's where you get things like the National Trust, because their job is to protect cultural and heritage sites. That's why museums are charitable, art galleries, theatres, because they all advance this particular charitable purpose. You've got the advancement of animal welfare, which is why you see lots of animal rights organisations. So Battersea Dogs Home as a charity as well. And then there's ones here around the armed forces and fire and rescue and ambulance services and human rights, etc. So first of all, just thinking, do my activities fall within these under these charitable purposes? And they won't register you if you're, even if you do some things which are charitable and some things which aren't, they won't register you. So just to bear that in mind. And then going back to checking that you meet the public benefit requirements. So this was the other criteria for being a charity, was that you benefited a sufficient section of the public. So again, just checking this bit of guidance here to make sure that you meet that requirement. Again, it doesn't have to be the whole public, it just needs to be a sufficient section. And that this key point here is that it's not giving rise to more than incidental personal benefit. So again, there's no ability to take profit out of the organization. But if sometimes like if you're a corporate entity, they're a bit funny about it because they can see that there's lots of benefit going to the corporate company as opposed to the general public. And if you're just maybe benefiting like your staff, for example, there isn't sufficient public benefit in setting up an organization that only benefits like staff at an organization. So that's, and making sure that, and then the other thing is that there's benefit and not harm to people. And an interesting one is like, people who set up animal rights charities, they're actually quite hard to register as a charity, especially if they advocate for no animal testing, like completely, because the Charity Commission doesn't think that there's necessarily public benefit in having no animal testing taking place. So you can't always register animal rights charities, but that's just an example of the public benefit. I mentioned before you need to have trustees. So as a charity, the Charity Commission expects there to be at least three trustees of an organization, of a charity. And these are usually the unpaid volunteers that are responsible for the management of the organization, the strategic oversight, not the day-to-day carrying out the charitable activity, but coming together to making sure that the charity is meeting its purposes and there's good governance, there's policies in place, etc. And then once you've identified those trustees, what you need to do is prepare your constitution. And the constitution is essentially the rules which govern your organization. So they'll set out what your charitable purpose is. And they also set out things like how many trustees. So you've got the minimum amount of trustees. It will talk about how meetings of the trustees take place. So they'll say the trustees will meet maybe 4 times a year. This is how the trustees take a decision. So we'll say trustees take decisions by majority is the usual way of taking a decision, and there'll be certain decisions which might require a higher threshold of trustees. So it's just basically the rules of the organization which people can, and funders, when they're looking at a charity, they'll look at these rules, and this will help them to understand how your organization is run and what your charitable purpose is. So the slightly complicating factor here is which one to pick. There's ones here if you want to have a wide membership for a charity. So the best example is, for example, if you were setting up a sports club and you wanted to have all of the members of the sports club participate in the governance of the organization, you would pick maybe this set of this constitution here, which says a constitution with voting members other than the charity trustees. So you've got not just the charities as your charity trustees as your members, but you've got a wider group of individuals or stakeholders that also want to be involved in the organization. But most people just go for this model here, which is where the charity trustees are also the members, and the members the equivalent of the shareholders in a for-profit company, which is slightly complicated, but just to point out that distinction. And then going back to so once you've prepared your constitution, that's one step. Part of that is, again, drafting your charitable objects. So you know that you're charitable, but what you have to do is state what your charitable purpose is, and these are called your objects. And the Charity Commission is quite specific about how you word this, and if you word it incorrectly, they'll just reject your application. And so it's quite hard to go through now, but I would really recommend watching this video here, which just helps you with how to construct that charitable purpose, and making sure, instead of just describing all the activities, it's more like saying the purpose of this organization is to, for example, advance education in Hackney through, and maybe just give an example of how you're going to do it, but not to give loads and loads of detail which limits your charitable purpose. But that, if you need to get advice, I would say that is the main bit to get right in your organization, is those objects. And then once you've prepared your objects, you sort of need to check that the name of your charity is available. So I always recommend going to the Charity Commission's website and just making sure there's no other charity with your name. So obviously, if you wanted to call it Active Horizons, you would see that there's already a charity called Active Horizons, and therefore you can't register your charity with that name. You should also look at Companies House to check there's no organization there with the same name. Again, they won't. So you can see here, there's nothing on Companies House. That's fine, but there is one on the Charity Commission register already. Everything's gone a bit weird. And the other thing to make sure is that there aren't any, if there are sensitive words in your name, so for example, if you wanted to call yourself, I don't know, something with if you said like the investment fund, for example, the charitable investment fund, that's a sensitive word, and you need to get permission from the relative entity. So you'd need to go to the Financial Conduct Authority and ask them to give you permission to use the word fund in your name. Another example, again, you couldn't just say that we're like the Royal Society of X without getting permission from the Crown to use the word royal in the name. Anything which implies like an association with like the police or the armed forces, you also need to get consent, and anything that implies association with a government body also needs consent. So it's just to check, and even things like trust also needs to get consent. So just a flag that, check the name, and also check if there's any sensitive words involved. So I keep not being able to see my screen. And then the biggest step of applying for charity registration is to complete the charity application. And this is a really long document, essentially, which asks you lots of different questions about your organization, what your activities are, who your beneficiaries are, and how you're funded as well. So it's a really long application, and the more detail you put in.
I wanted to double check something. Sure. I'll also just send it to you directly to make sure you have it, but
Oh, thank you.
I'll
Thank
put
you.
it in the main chat.
Sorry to my group, I was just saying, if you are registering a charity, just the more detail you put in the application, the better. And it's quite likely that the Charity Commission will ask more questions if they're not satisfied with your responses. And quite often, if you have a business plan as well that you can attach, then that can help them as well. But yeah, the rest of the steps are on that sheet, but it's a bit of a process.